Hello and welcome to the podcast on navigating India US strategic partnership under the global crisis. I'm very happy to have Professor Deepa Ollypally with us today. She is a professor of international affairs, associate director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, and the director for the Rising Powers Initiative at Elit School of International Affairs, George Washington University. We welcome you to Christ University, ma'am. Very glad to have you with us here today. So, ma'am, let me dive into the first question. Since you work in Washington, D.C., and you meet a lot of policymakers and American analysts there, what do you think is the sense of how US views India in the strategic calculus right now, especially with the ongoing global crisis?
Thank you very much, Kriti. Happy to be here. That's a good question. I have been in the US and just arrived here recently, so I can give a sense of what the thinking is. I would say that in the last 5, 6 years, the United States has taken a view that India is one of its priority partners and becoming essential in many ways to US strategic interests. And there's also a recognition over time that the US needs a network of partners, not necessarily allies, but partners, because there is a sense that it is becoming overstretched, that it simply will not be able to have the same resources it used to, and so it needs partners like India. And especially because the US has been rebalancing to the Indo Pacific. India, of course, becomes absolutely critical. And against that, of course, we are seeing the Ukraine crisis, the Middle East crisis unfolding. And there was a lot of initial disappointment in the US, in Washington, about the way in which India kind of struck out on its own views vis a vis Russia and did not follow the line that the US was taking, including things like the sanctions and so on, which India did not go along with. But what I've seen over the few years now is a new understanding in Washington about India's strategic culture, about India's interests. And I think I would say that it has become what I would call socialized to an Indian way of foreign policy. And so I think these crises, I would also say that they have not given Indo US relations the same test as perhaps a crisis in Asia might. So, but from what I have seen, there is a great deal of strategic trust that has been built up. And I think that has made it easier to navigate these sort of divergences, and it has not derailed the relationship. And I don't see it really derailing, even though the challenges on a daily basis is there, such as votes against the kind of voting patterns you see, sanctions, the visits, and the relationship between Mr. Modi and Mr. Putin. All of these things come under some critical views in the U.S., but they're willing to tolerate it. Put it that way.
Thank you, ma'am. That was very interesting. Now, ma'am, this leads me to the second question where, where do you think the US can contribute when it comes to Indian security? And what do you think, where does India stand to gain from that? And when we look at the perceived China threat, how is it related to all this?
Yes. One thing I would say off the bat is that you cannot really understand US India relations simply as a balancing move against China. I think it's far too simplistic. I think balancing, it doesn't really give you the sense of prospects in that relationship that is there. And so for the Indian side, it seems to me that at this moment, for India to rise as a comprehensive global power, it needs the United States. And I think it's the only country that can provide, whether it's political support, diplomatic, strategic cover, economic and technological backing, all of these things I think are crucial in terms of what the US brings to India. And the US doesn't bring itself, it brings a large network of allies, treaty allies as well. Things like the Quad, for example. And this is where the China question comes up because no matter how you look at it, whether it's economically or at the military, the profiles of India and China are vastly different. India is outgunned, India is far poorer than China, and so it simply cannot compete by itself. And it needs a partner, and I think the no other partner individually can provide that. And I think that is something that India is realizing because no matter what, the US, one thing it wants to see is a successful India for their own reasons, no doubt. But it just so happens that that brings a lot of convergences in their thinking, a meeting of the minds. And I think that that is the what I want to underline so that you cannot simply say it's only because of China and that and leave it at that, which I think too many people do.
Yes, definitely, ma'am. I think this clears a bit of, the China factor that we all keep talking about. And you very elaborately just chalked it out very well that why the China factor is not the only factor we should be considering. So this leads me to the final question, ma'am. To conclude, what challenges do you think are faced by both the countries in terms of maintaining this strategic relationship in their bilateral relations?
Yes, because no matter how good the relationship is, you're going to have challenges. And it's better to, I think, identify them and deal with them rather than avoiding them. And in this case, from a strategic partnership position, I would say that one of the potential landmines is if US and China, the competition heats up too much. Because then, the idea that India's partnership with the United States and India will be called upon to do certain things it may not want to do, give the support that the Americans might expect because of the fact that there's a live border issue for India with China. And given its weaker position, it does not want to be in that vulnerable position right now. So I think that is a fear, what I would call entrapment, if the relationship really nosedives with between U.S. and China. But so India is going to have to be very careful managing the China relationship while at the same time improving and going full force with the U.S. That's the strategic side, but I think there are other potential problems. And those are, I think, of a kind that are somewhat socio-cultural, ideological kind of issues, as well as some economic. So if, for example, the US becomes a little bit more inward looking, more protectionist in its economics, India is going to be uh, a victim of that. Because if India has a trade surplus with the US, and the US will go after those countries in many ways, whether it's at the WTO or targeting and taking away certain advantages that it had given them. So that's one thing. If there is a protectionist move in the US, then the US is having economic difficulty right now as well. But I think the Indian bright spot in economics is going to make it so that the US will somehow want to kind of paper over those issues as well. The other challenge is that I think the ideologically the US, especially in Congress, there is a sense that the United States is the upholder of the rule of law, of democracy, and I think if it sees a certain backsliding in the Indian context on those things, I think there will be questions raised and that both sides will have to try and work through them. It will be uncomfortable, but I think, again, on the strategic side, that momentum have sort of taken off. So I don't see it becoming derailed relationship.
Thank
So
you
I'm
so much.
optimistic.
Thank you so much. So are we. So thank you so much, ma'am, for being with us here today. And we would love to have you again and discuss the US India strategic partnership. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you again.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Kriti.